thank the WAM Collective, the Weisman Student Group, and the Student Service Fees also for supporting this event. Thank you to the Wells Fargo Foundation Minnesota for supporting our operational budget, to the Target Foundation for supporting the construction of the Studio for Creative Collaboration that I curate. And thank you to Cindy and Jay Ihlenfeld for the endowment that makes my position here possible. And finally, I'm grateful to my colleagues at the Weisman Art Museum for supporting the program for creative collaboration that I lead and for making this event happen. As we will hear from speakers, we invite you to submit your questions and thoughts through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will respond to your Q&A questions after the presentations. Please note that you can upvote the questions that look the most interesting to you by hitting the like button, and then questions that receive more votes will rise up and we will prioritize those. You should choose Fit to Window from the View option menu at the top to make sure presentations fit your screen. Otherwise, you will just see portions of those. And we will be recording this event tonight, and this event will be posted later on the Weisman YouTube channel. We also have live transcriptions going on, but you need to choose that option if you want to use it. It's at the bottom of your screen on your right-hand side. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for the evening. Carolyn Cinders is a critical designer and artist who examines the intersection of artificial intelligence, abuse, and politics in digital conversational spaces. She has worked with the United Nations, Amnesty International, IBM, and Wikimedia, and held fellowships with Harvard, Google, Mozilla, Ars Electronica, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, and many others. Her work has been featured in the Tate Modern, Victoria and Albert Museum, MoMA PS1, Laboral, and other places. Carolyn joins us from Berlin today, and it's just past 2 a.m. there, so special kudos to Carolyn for this. Christopher Lehman is a professor of ethnic studies at St. Cloud State University. He's a member of Phi Beta Kappa and was a visiting fellow at the Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. His latest book, Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State, won the 2020 Minnesota Book Award for Minnesota Nonfiction. Christopher also has a new TED Talk that's just out on the same subject, so look it up. It's very interesting. There's a phrase there that really stuck in my mind that says, admitting to the horror makes you American. And I hope we can expand on that later on. Brooks Turner is an artist, writer, and educator whose recent work engages with the history of fascism in Minnesota. He teaches at St. Cloud State, and he is also the chair of the visual arts at St. Paul Conservatory for Performing Arts. Lorenzo Fabbri, cultural scholar from the University of Minnesota, and one of the people who greatly informed Brooks's research, was supposed to be with us today, but unfortunately he had to cancel due to family emergency. Wishes of health to him and the family. This event accompanies Brooks's exhibition in print, a 32-page newspaper that is a result of research that Brooks did during his residency at the Target Studio for Creative Collaboration last spring. The newspaper was delivered to the Twin Cities Star Tribune subscribers on the last Sunday of October. You're welcome to stop by the museum before Friday, because after Friday, museum will be closed with everything else in this state for 4 weeks. So before Friday, you can stop by the museum and pick up a copy, or you can, on the project page on the website, you can order a copy and it will be delivered to your home. Welcome to our Pecha event. Carolyn, the stage is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to get started. Since these slides are supposed to be 20 seconds per slide, but it is late where I am. And sorry, give me 1 second, trying to find my mouse because I need it. Great. Hi, I'm Carolyn Cinders. Welcome to my talk entitled Emotional Malware. I'm an artist and researcher interested in processes, human rights, and systems. As a creator, I use design and art as a way to critique and explore the world around me. I've held residencies with the Harvard Kennedy School, the Mozilla Foundation, IBEAM, and I'm currently a fellow with Ars Electronica's AI Lab, as well as a visiting fellow with the Weisman Institute, looking at AI, labor, and systems. Sorry. I've been using graphs as an artistic means to unpack research ideas and context within my work. And I view them in relationship to this descriptor of emotional malware, which looks at how people share and create content within the digital commons. So what is emotional malware? Clay Shirky wrote in his canonical book in 2008, Here Comes Everybody, on new formation of the public commons inside of the internet. The term, Here Comes Everybody, specifically was a provocative emphasis on what the internet does well in terms of organizing. It allows people as singular entities with no institutional affiliation to organize and create new spaces of organization. In essence, create new modes and meanings of what organization could mean and then be defined in these digital spaces. To organize doesn't mean being rooted in physicality. Ideas can manifest, fester, grow, and replicate inside of software. Ideas could be the reason for organizing and the nexus of communities. A tweet can start a space of large-scale conversation. That conversation doesn't need to be housed in a body or any physical structure. It's now housed in the open internet. But in an era of misinformation, of disinformation, of rising populism, of online harassment, of mistrust and surveillance, what kinds of conversations exist inside the commons now? When and how does the commons serve us in this emotionally fraught time by giving us emotionally fraught information? What do transparency and clarity look like when our conversations are conflict-ridden, housed within opaque algorithmic systems? In an essay in 2017, I started using this metaphor and term emotional malware as a way to define some of the aspects and folds of fake news. Emotional malware is a form of digital and targeted political turmoil designed to work effectively within social networks and to feed upon the emotions. It's activated and aesthetically pointed propaganda with all the designs and imitations to mimic a trustworthy news source or a campaign. In essence, it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. While a fellow with BuzzFeed and IBEAM in 2016, I was researching online harassment and social networks right before the United States presidential election. I was tracking and following the beginnings of the alt-right, and I was studying harassment groups inside of spaces like Twitter, Reddit, 4chan, 8chan, and a message board called Vote. From this research, I created a series of graphs to explore the research I was conducting as a way to sort of situate myself in what I was seeing. Design and art serve as explorative avenues of wayfinding and path making, particularly in researching and unpacking memes, algorithms, and social networks. In 2017, I made this graph to help situate myself after researching the alt-right for 6 months and working with the Southern Poverty Law Center to then sort of check place what this graph would mean and how researchers would respond to it. The circles here are not drawn to numerical scale, i.e. the size of the alt-right circle doesn't correlate to the amount of tweets I've scraped, but to the size of the idea or how widespread the political ideology is. The alt-right in 2016 was a very, very broad ideology, and it housed a lot of other more specific ideologies within it. Now, is this data? If a journalist were to ask me to publish this, I'd have a really hard time saying yes unless it was an op-ed piece, because this is a sketch of the data I was looking at of a culture in flux. So it's a snapshot of that time and what's changed. And now it's maybe changed only somewhat slightly. Within this ideology, you will see a scale. And this scale comes from research and a sort of scale of extremism created by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So we see this kind of lineup of white nationalism to ex-military. And this is a working scale of severity inside of hate ideology, or at least it's one for now. This graph, also from 2017, sort of best illustrates what we could call a context collapse, an overlapping of all these different kinds of terms, and how the alt-right will sort of start to use different terms or descriptors interchangeably. But I updated this graph in 2020. Sorry. I updated this graph in 2020. The alt-right isn't really a term that's used very much anymore at all, because it's not so much of an alternative, but an established norm. And the groups now are so much further right. So an updated graph would have the alt-right entirely removed. Over Twitter DM, the researcher Whitney Phillips and I talked about misinformation and harm. Phillips uses terms like weaponized memes or polluted information to cover a multitude of deliberate and inadvertent harms. Harm here is important, since some of the content that is created inside of emotional malware or inside of misinformation, disinformation campaigns may not have intended to be harmful or harassing, but can use to harm and harass, especially against specific individuals. The consequences are what matter more than what the meme was initially created to be or do. Weaponized memes gives a framing that allows for memes that weren't originally harmful or harassing, much like Pepe, which started off as a stoner cartoon from California, but then become weaponized. Phillips emphasizes that the rhetoric and research should be focused on the impact of the content rather the intention of the content, so that the outcomes and the ripple effects of harm are then centered. Naming an action can help make it more real. For online harassment, naming an action like doxing, which is the release of public documents like someone's phone number or their identification card or a personal email. Naming that action, suddenly the action can be documented, tracked, and understood. Doxing is now a part of almost every major platform and website's terms of service as an action to not engage in. So language gives truth to power. So being able to name different kinds of harms is incredibly important. Within that context of naming harms and exploring nuance, I made this graph to unpack and explain trolling in 2016. It was made in response to the misuse of the word trolling, especially by trolls. The misuse of naming every action from the humorous to the harassing flattens and minimizes harmful actions. Trolling is applied to so many different kinds of actions. It encompasses a range of varying actions, identities, and events that span from the humorously annoying to the dangerous. A particular action is charted in the matrix based on the legality of the behavior, how hard it is to fix the effects, American Western cultural taboos, the emotional weight for the trolled individual, and the societal and personal power of both the troll and then the victim. Pollsters trolled voters by asking them in 2016 if the US should bomb Agrabah, the home of Disney's Aladdin. 30% of GOP voters and 19% of Democrat voters said yes, thus completing the joke about political ignorance. And I'm using this example as a form of trolling to show where it would sit on the graph. Trolling is a broad word. We use it to describe anonymous sending pizza to Scientologists. But we also use it to describe someone tweeting rape threats. Humor is not the same as abuse, but calling trolling links them both together. The graph should be a living document, which I've so crudely updated for this talk, and I apologize for that. Because what needs to be addressed within this graph is power. Actions and harm are not if-then statements or events in isolation. Power changes the context of an action. Donald Trump is president of the United States now and will hopefully be leaving in January. So him tweeting something that could be viewed as childish bullying about a person is extremely harmful given the context of who he is. Power in a person's platform changes the level of harm of a piece of content, a post, or even an event. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm sorry I've gone over.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. As we're switching presentations to Christopher, I just want to note that we have 144 participants at the moment. So if we were in a physical space, it would be a pretty full house now. Christopher, the stage is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. I will share my screen now. Minnesota is not a diverse state. Most of its residents and most of its cities and towns classify themselves as white. But how did Minnesota's lack of diversity come into existence? Was it too far to the north? No, because slaves escaped all the way to Canada. Slavery played a major role in Minnesota's lack of diversity, which sounds like a strange thing to say, but enslavers brought slaves here only seasonally, in the spring and summer, and then took them back south down the Mississippi River in the fall. So African Americans were a temporary presence in Minnesota. In 1854, US President Franklin Pierce signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which led people in Minnesota to think that they could legalize slavery when Minnesota became a state. They developed Minnesota while retaining the option of enslaving dark-skinned people. Because Minnesota was a territory, Pierce, as president, appointed enslavers and pro-slavery people to Minnesota's government. Enslaver Joseph Travis Rosser was Pierce's choice for lieutenant governor, and Pierce picked Willis Gorman here as a pro-slavery governor. Gorman invited enslavers from Maryland to invest in Minnesota's real estate. Harwood Iglehart and William Sprigg Hall came to St. Paul and developed the Payne Fallon neighborhood. Their streets had Southern names like Maryland and Magnolia. Wealthy Minnesotans at the time sold furs for the American Fur Company. The company was run by enslavers in St. Louis. As the employees built cities in Minnesota, they learned the importance of attracting rich investors, many of whom were Southern and enslavers. To protect the fur trade, the U.S. Army built forts across the Northwest, including Fort Snelling here. Although federal laws kept Minnesotans from enslaving, Southern troops who were sent to Minnesota were allowed to bring a slave. The Army even paid them for the cost of providing for them. Sylvanus Lowry worked for American Fur for 3 years. After leaving the company, he spent his wealth on land, buying over 400 lots of land in central Minnesota in 1855. These lots became the northern part of the new city of St. Cloud in 1856, and Lowry became the first mayor there. Lowry came from a family of ministers of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in Tennessee. The church ran Cumberland University. One of its instructors used money from the university to buy land for himself. The university eventually sued him and won. Lowry received $12,000 in land sales in 1856 alone. He spent that money building warehouses in St. Cloud in order to rent them to local entrepreneurs. He later started the St. Cloud Times newspaper, which still operates today. In 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court legalized slavery in Minnesota. Lowry's brother-in-law then brought 2 slaves named Butler with him from Tennessee to live full-time in St. Cloud. When Minnesota outlawed slavery, he took them back to Tennessee and sold them. Butler Park is named after them. American Fur Company fur trader Henry Rice used his payments from enslavers to develop land in Washington, D.C., and to start a hotel business in Minnesota. He also became a successful politician, serving in the U.S. House of Representatives. While there, he became friends with enslavers. One friend, William Aiken of South Carolina, enslaved over 700 people. The bulk of them grew rice and other crops on an island near Charleston. The rest of the slaves lived and worked at his mansion in Charleston, which still stands today. Rice invited Aiken to visit Minnesota. Aiken did, and while here, he saw that the University of Minnesota was closed down. He loaned $15,000 to the university right then, in 1856. His loan allowed the university to reopen. The university never fully repaid him. American Fur Company fur trader Henry Sibley used his payments from enslavers to develop Mendota. He was employed by American furs enslavers for almost 3 decades, even while serving as the governor of Minnesota when it finally became a free state in 1858. American Fur Company fur trader John Prince was the last of the Minnesotans to leave for the company. He received money from the enslavers well into the 1860s. He used some of his money from them to establish the city of Princeton, Minnesota. Alabama enslaver George Clitheroe was appointed a land register by President James Buchanan. While in Minnesota, he invested in land in Scott County, despite having his appointment in Ottertail County. Lake Clitheroe and the city of Clitheroe are named after him. Some people sold away all their slaves in the South and then came to Minnesota without them. The Garrick family of Baton Rouge, Louisiana did this in 1857. When they arrived in Minnesota, they spent their money from the slave auction on dozens of lots in the city of Shakopee. This history matters. When Minnesota doesn't see itself as part of an awful national history of terror against African Americans, then events like George Floyd's killing stand out as something Minnesota wouldn't do. Floyd was a Minnesotan, but still tied to the state's heritage of violence against African Americans. Money from slavery made Minnesota what it is. The absence of slaves, because of Minnesotans using only their money, also made Minnesota what it is. Just because a group of people is small in number does not make it unimportant. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. And the last presentation, Brooks. Stage is yours.
Okay. So in answering the question, how will we know fascism when we see it? I propose the use of aesthetic stylization. I recently presented 2 bodies of work that explore the aesthetics of fascism through collage, drawing, and sculpture. And a lot of the slides that I've included here are examples from those works. Oops. So these exhibitions were in response to my encounter primarily with the New Liberator and Liberation magazine, both of which were edited by William Dudley Pele. Pele founded the Silver Shirts in 1933, inspired by Hitler's appointment as chancellor in Germany. The New Liberator was published from 1930 to 1932 as a journal of Christian mysticism. So even though the content wasn't explicitly political, you can still see fascism and Aryanism merging with Americanism in the symbols that he used in his magazine. And so this collage is essentially an index of every symbol that appeared in the New Liberator. And what you see in looking at this is, there's an American eagle, which obviously has symbolic significance with regard to our history. There's colonial architecture, churches, farming and transportation by sea. There's even pirate symbolism like this skull or the skull and crossbones and treasure chests. And all of these aspects are an attempt to cite origin in the New World. And that citation of origin is a key element to American fascism. And then also, if you look throughout there are additional mythological elements, which are, I think, also key to American fascism and to Aryanism. In Liberation, which was the Journal of the Silver Legion of America, also known as Silver Shirts, it's much more politically or directly political and Nazi in origin. So from 1930 to the start of publishing Liberation in 1933, you can see this transformation from sort of Christian mysticism and Aryanism to directly pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi. So, there's tons of representations of Hitler, of anti-Semitism, as well as additional elements of American history, such as, George Washington praying in the woods before battle, representations of the White House, and then also there's representations of Christ, especially this one here where he's holding a whip and whipping the crowd, which became an essential sort of emblem of the Silver Legion. But this kind of citing American history or positioning Nazism and Hitlerism within American history is really obvious in looking through the covers of each of these magazines. And in particular here, where you have Washington, Lincoln, and Hitler all represented as if they belong in the same group together, as if they are part of the same mythological heritage. So this is a passage directly taken from the Liberation from a issue that was published in 1938. And I'm going to read it. It's very similar to, I think, a lot of things we hear from Trump today. The silver shirts will not alter the American form of government. The silver shirts will restore it. The American form of government now, the American form of government now exists in husk form only. It is now but a hollow shell for usurpations of Yiddish Sovietism. The silver shirts will attempt to restore the American form of government, but it won't be democracy. It will be republicanism. That this nation is a democracy or has ever been a democracy is more blatherskite smokescreen. The silver shirts will attempt to restore a constitutional republic, but with this addition. They will see to it that proper safeguards are set up so that no swarms of quasi-Orientals in future may subvert its institutions to steal the nation blind and debauch its Christian stamina. So from reading these magazines, I sort of put together a theory of an aesthetic presentation of American fascism, which breaks down into 4 categories. Origins, which is a lot about history and genealogy, Europe, Christianity, Aryanism, whiteness, and then also a right to landscape. And then imperialism, which has a lot to do with militancy and the masculine domination of people in the land, as well as the machine of industry. And then nationalism, which has a lot to do with, which is really about forming a singular cultural identity of an entire population, which in the 1930s was often referred to as Americanism. And then there's also the threat of the outsider in nationalism. And then finally, restoration, which is to restore the true political form of America from the past, which is no longer present, which is often anti-democratic. Now, even though I've identified these 4 sort of tenets of aesthetic presentation of American fascism, I think it's key that not all have to be manifest in order to identify something as fascism. It can be a mixture of them. So during and after World War II, Gerald L.K. Smith attempted to continue to advance fascism through the America First Party, which notably is different than the America First Committee, Lindbergh's thing, and then later the Christian Nationalist Front. So his background is that in 1933, he had joined the Silver Shirts, but left to take up with Huey Long. And sort of then after all of these other fascist leaders were either arrested or died, he ended up leading a sort of fascist charge during and after World War II. And so I've sort of summarized his tenets, which I have his original text on the next page. But his tenets break down of his version of fascism break down to anti-Semitism and a conspiratorial threat to Christianity, threat from an exaggerated or imaginary far left, rhetorical sleight of hand to couple fascism with big government, anti-Black racism through a separate but equal false version of democracy, nationalism, isolationism, anti-globalism, Americanism as the truest political ideology, white immigrants only, and selective constitutional originalism. So in 1946, a coalition of veterans, Jews, and unions responded to Smith speaking in Minneapolis with a large protest, blocking the entrance to the hotel where he was supposed to speak. Smith's supporters tried to push through, resulting in a minor scuffle. And to my knowledge, this did not result in significant injuries or arrests. But the next day, Hubert Humphrey, who was then mayor of Minneapolis, condemned both sides, the protesters and the fascist Smith supporters, as rabble-rousing peace disturbers. I think he actually said disturbers of the peace rather than peace disturbers. But nonetheless, it shockingly to me mimicked the kind of language of Trump's there are good people on both sides. And obviously said in a different context, but nonetheless sort of casting doubt on the protest against fascism. And I read one historian suggest that this move solidified Humphrey's relationship to business interests in Minneapolis, interests that had been protesting union activity in the 1930s, particularly the Teamster strike. And so as a kind of way of summing up my interest in my talk here, fascism presents through aesthetics, but that aesthetic presentation is not absolute. There is not a singular aesthetics, but rather a kind of gray aesthetic area. And two, that both sidesism allows fascism to fester and propagate. That both sidesism distracts us from actually actively countering fascist threats and fascist presentations. So thank you.
Thank you so much to Brooks and to all the speakers. Now, pecha is a format that kind of redistributes the balance that we usually have in scholarly discussions. Usually we will have long lectures and then a little bit of Q&A. And then when the most interesting questions start, we need to stop. So now we have it the other way around. We had very, very short presentations, and we want to spend the rest of our time today in discussion and in answering your questions. So please start shooting your questions to the Q&A. I like to use my privilege as a moderator and ask the first question myself. And I'd like to kick off this discussion today with the help of Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison, in 1995, she gave this striking address to Howard University. It was called Racism and Fascism. So I will read a tiny bit of it. Let us be reminded that before there is a final solution, there must be a first solution, a second one, even a third. The move towards the final solution is not a jump. It takes one step, then another, something perhaps like this. Construct an internal enemy as both focus and diversion. 2, isolate and demonize that enemy by unleashing and protecting the utterance of overt and codename calling and verbal abuse. Employ ad hominem attacks as legitimate charges against the enemy. Enlist and create sources and distributors of information who are willing to reinforce the demonizing process because it is profitable, because it grants power, and because it works. And then later on, she goes on. Conservative, moderate, liberal, left, right, hard left, far right, religious, secular, socialist. We must not be blindsided by these Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola labels, because the genius of fascism is that any political structure can host a virus and virtually any developed country can become a suitable home. Fascism talks ideology, but it is really just marketing for power. So I want to ask our speakers to reflect on this passage and maybe specifically on this question of, would you agree that fascism is little more than a strategy for marketing power?
I agree.
I feel like it's very hard to argue with Toni Morrison, so I also agree. I think, I think fascism is an embodiment of a specific kind of structured power, one that like we see deep roots tied to white supremacy and also populism. But I do think also just like the framing of it, if we're thinking of like the propagandized nature of how information spreads in relationship to fascism, looking at like the graphic design history of it, that it is like thinking of like the term marketing is perhaps an apt way to think of it. And perhaps those that hold a lot of power in an unjust society would be very uninclined to give it up.
I'd have to agree as well. There was all sorts of isolation taking place, whether it was through the Middle Passage or the Trail of Tears. And with the ad hominem attacks, you can take your pick of any ethnic slur that applies to different groups of people. And certainly with political labeling, people who wanted to fight for equality and for civil rights were called communists, they were called un-American, and all sorts of things. So all those ingredients are certainly there for American fascism.
I mean, I was thinking about too, Umberto Eco's text on your fascism, you are fascism. And in that text, he sort of identifies how, there are so many different things that have been labeled fascism, and why are some things like don't have the same tenets, and yet they are the same ideology, and yet they still fall under this idea of being fascism. And I think to me, that's why fascism is is ultimately manifest through aesthetics and through that like marketing of identity. I mean, it's almost like a random flailing in terms of what actually presents as the ideology, but still falls back on ultimately a kind of like amorphous grouping.
Thank you. And the second question goes to another privileged group of people. It's the WAM Collective. It's a student collective of the museum that helped produce this event and also funded. This question is from the WAM Collective member, Özge Hunbay. And it's pretty provocative, I love it. Is there such thing as good fascism? What would a perfectly functioning fascist government look like?
I don't think that you could have good fascism, as far as I understand it to be. I had always thought that a fascist government was a government that oppressed a specific group of people. And so if oppression is part of the mix from the beginning, how could that possibly be good?
I mean, I guess Nazism was good for Aryans, but that doesn't mean that like morally it was good or acceptable by any stretch of the imagination. I think I've encountered, and I have the Q&A open and saw another question about whether there's left-wing fascisms. And I've encountered people who have asked, can you use a kind of like fascist hard line, violent methodology to instill, like, essentially, do the ends justify the means? Can you use the kind of violence of fascism or the takeover of fascism in order to create a more socially just society in the end of it? And I don't think you can. I think ultimately the means matter, and that the means influence what happens through that. So no, I don't. Yeah, I agree. I don't think I think it's impossible. I think it's impossible for fascism to be ethically okay.
I would echo both those sentiments. I think if we are thinking of fascism as like a hard line or a hard response, I would emphasize also that fascism comes with an inherent militarized violence to it of enforcing those harms. Whereas if we're talking about trying to build off leftist ideals, what does the enforcement of that look like? I'm not a lawyer, so the examples I often pull from will be things related to internet policy. That's more the area I exist in. But imagine like a more nuanced and intersectional enforcement of Facebook's policies. Facebook has currently actually pretty decent policies. They're just not enacted at scale in a way that works. And there's a variety of reasons around that. Some of it is they don't have enough distributed workforce with content moderators. Content moderators are not paid enough, nor are they sort of supported enough. But imagine those policies as like a rule that we care about or exist in, or even better, like certain civil rights laws we have in existence now, or certain laws around like freedom of expression. What does the enforcement of that look like? So the enforcement doesn't have to be a militarized, violent response. It can be citations, it can be taxes, it can be you have to pay a fine, right? So like if we pass, for example, a law on limiting, I don't know, God, this is how tired I am. Limiting like energy outputs. That's what I was going for. I was like electricity, something, environment, but some kind of environmentally focused law. What does implementation of that look like at scale? The implementation does not have to be one that looks like a fascist regime. What does it look like in another way, right? And so I think when we think of these futures where there has to be a radical shift in our society towards a more equitable one, if the idea is that the leftists would be fascist, well, we have to talk about the implementation of that reality, right? And so I think it would come down to that implementation of what that looks like.
Yeah, and as somebody who grew up in the former Soviet Union, I can totally relate to that. There is a question at the top of our Q&A. There is a question to Carolyn. And since again, Carolyn is kind of in very early or very late hours of her day, depending where you're looking from, she might leave us early. So if you have specific questions for her, please shoot them right away before she leaves us. So Carolyn,
I'm still feeling super awake, which is surprising.
Thank you for bearing with us. How have you seen meme culture and social media changing the nature of fascism? Specifically, is there a way in which the visual nature of memes exacerbates the spread of fascist ideology? How have fascist and alt-right groups co-opted historical and art historical conventions to make their ideology more pernicious?
That's such a great question. I feel like I wish Whitney Phillips was here to sort of unpack that question more. She's an ethnographer, 4chan, and a professor at Syracuse University. So she looks a lot at this subject. I mean, I would say a big thing is actually like irony if we go back to the trolling framework. So I would say like when you post things online, trying to unpack intention can be difficult. And originally, I think that's a lot of the ways that social networks policy existed was how do you understand intent versus impact? So is someone intending to harm? A lot of this also deals with how the things we say online, what is the likelihood of the impact offline? So I'll give you an example with online harassment. So the reason that a lot of rape threats aren't considered actionable rape threats online is because you'd have to present a likelihood that like the person giving that threat knows you or that you have some kind of offline interaction. But then also the way that like US law tends to work is it's on like a state-by-state basis. So if someone makes a threat to you and it is deemed actionable by this sort of framework of like, do you actually interact with each other? Have you ever met before? Then you have to sort of go based off the state where the person made the threat. So if someone is in Minnesota and writes a rape threat to me, I would have to like open this court case in Minnesota. I would not be able to take that person to task here in Germany. So a big thing with policy was trying to figure out like the intention and then the likelihood of something, because a lot of internet policy is constructed in the United States where we have a very specific view of what free speech is. In Germany, here there are much stronger anti-Semitism laws, and there's actually, that's true in a lot of Europe post World War II because of World War II. So like there is a different kind of, there are different laws that deal with hate speech content in different ways. This is where you see platforms creating policy now to respond to harms without necessarily having to deal with intent. And this is where we talk about, is it enacted? So like, are all rape threats taken down? Why or why not? Even though they technically violate the policies now that internet companies have made. So before we even start to think about aesthetics, like we have to also talk about intention and impact and how like policy is written and then how that policy, like how the rubber sort of hits the road when policy is enacted, and it's not necessarily enacted well at scale. So inside of this very imperfect system, you've created an ecosystem where like a violent ideology can very much grow. I would then say that like irony culture, which is a big part of internet culture and meme culture, does mask harm in a way. This is where you have someone. So like if you look at Pepe, specifically like the history of Pepe, I'm working on a project with Rise. I'm actually archiving Pepe, so I'm going to try to summarize part of this. Matt Fury really liked to engage in the beginning with his fans, where they would meme Pepe in different ways. So like Pepe getting ice cream, like they would remix Pepe and redraw Pepe, and he would not extend his copyright to that because he liked that internet culture. So there was like a bunch of different boards on places like Reddit and 4chan where people would then try to collect rare Pepes. So people would be drawing Pepes, putting them online, and people would be finding them, right? And this sort of led to a one-upping of like, what's the rarest Pepe? And because the internet is the internet and there is, call it something awful, the one-upping very quickly turned into how flamboyant can we get in terms of upsetting people, which is, if you then look at the history of Anonymous, it's a very similar kind of humor of like how the humor is going to get in terms of one-upping, either more gross, more dangerous, or more violently flamboyant. And so it was like, it didn't take very long to then starting to see rare Pepes in like Nazi uniforms, right? So I think part of it is understanding that like this kind of weird internet humor that's come out of message boards in particular, like I'm talking about 4chan, 8chan, and Reddit, that like the humor very quickly skews to this place of provocation and provocative humor that is actually also, one could argue, tasteless, because that's where the irony comes in. Like the irony is making a joke of Pepe in like a Nazi youth uniform, or the irony is making a joke of like sending someone a really intense like porn clip, right? So like the not suitable for works, like sending someone a clip and not saying what it is. These kinds of things of trolling, it's not a very far away leap from that being something like harassment or harm, but it does come from this place. So I would say it's not so much that like memes are masks for this kind of harm, but rather that like the structure of the joke already is in a place where you could very easily go to harm. And it does then, yes, allow for this proliferation of very like violent ideologies or far right ideologies. And the bigger issue is then platforms having to sort of create governance systems and effectively adjudicate these harms when they see them. And that often comes in conflict with how a platform determines free speech, right? And like this misinterpretation, I argue, of free speech online. So it's not just like meme culture allows for this, it supports that, but a lot of it is also in practice, how does a platform's governance system really work?
Well, and I feel the next question is also for you, but well, it's really for everybody. How do you take time for yourself when part of your work is to constantly take in and analyze such a negative material?
Ooh, that's a very good question. Art is usually my escape from that. But I personally do a bunch of different work, so I don't have one full-time job. So I work on online harassment research. I'm doing some work with Ellen Powell right now on measuring remote workplace harassment and toxicity. So while that is also has an aspect of emotional labor, because I'm often talking to either victims who have experienced harassment or are currently in the throes of harassment, it's different than like this stuff, right? So for me, it's like changing the pace of my work is pretty helpful. Like doing a talk like this and having that a part of my practice is also like a change for me. But I think also like I'm lucky in the sense that I work in civil society, and so I can often see the impacts more of the work that I'm doing, meaning like when I first started looking at online harassment until now, people understand online harassment more. I've seen that change. I've seen platforms respond and build up systems. They are very imperfect. They are not perfect at all, but I've at least been able to see changes. And so for me, that's also extremely helpful.
Christopher Brooks.
I think for me, learning about my family And my ancestry is what calms me down, or what I do in my spare time to relax. I really enjoy genealogy and just trying to go further and further back to see where I can find my earliest ancestors. And I've been doing it for about 20 years. And I've been able to find people who were enslaved, who were born in the 1780s or 1770s. But I have not found an ancestor who survived the Middle Passage yet. So that is the thing that I look for in my spare time. And even though that kind of research is hard to do, I really enjoy doing it, because whenever I find things, I'm learning about myself and my personal history ultimately. So that's very satisfying to me.
My partner and I just had a baby, so I cuddle with her.
Well, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Certainly a very good way of escapism.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I'm new to this country, and I have to admit that I don't know why do we celebrate the Labor Day in America on the day we celebrate it. But the question goes like this. Are Americans celebrating a form of fascism at Labor Day? Asking because the actual Labor Day celebrated worldwide on May 1st. Is America doing this not to acknowledge the fact that anarchists and other social groups fought for the rights of the working class? Are we all some sort of fascists?
Well, for one, I think that there is a way in which we're all implicated in American fascism, to some degree or the other. I can't speak to the specifics of Labor Day, but I do have another narrative that I came across recently and haven't had full time to invest in. But in Minnesota, we celebrate, or we have Aquatennial, which usually is like, big fireworks and everything. Everybody's excited and it's fun. That was created by business interests in Minnesota in order to dwarf the yearly union celebration of the success of the 1934 union strike. And so it was essentially directly an attempt to erase labor participation in American history, how much labor had affected the kind of like political reality of America. And they did it. The business interests were concerned that by having this regular celebration, this giant picnic that was getting more and more attention, more people would unionize, and there would be more union strength. Minnesota would become more left. And perhaps, the Farmer Labor Party had just been defeated, which was a huge success for those business interests, and that perhaps the continuation of this celebration would further or could show a return to that kind of more left-leaning political ideology. So I don't know the particulars of why America is, Labor Day is on May 1st, or why it would be different from the rest of the world. But I do think that how we think about and talk about labor in America is absolutely tied into ideas about fascism. I had also, in doing my research, reached out to a historian who had studied the silver shirts and labor history in Minnesota, and I sort of picked his brain a little bit, and he kind of told me, looking at the Silver Legion isn't enough. They're just like this weird fringe group. You need to look at like basically the entire business and political structure of Minneapolis in the 1930s to really understand fascism. And I don't have the like skills as a historian to be able to do that. But I do think that, anyways, to your question, absolutely asking about labor and investigating labor is key to understanding how fascism manifests in America.
Do you guys have anything to add to this?
Well, when it comes to looking at whether we are all fascists, I wouldn't say that every single American citizen is a fascist, but every American certainly benefits from fascism, which is not the same thing. I mean, there's a reason why we pay tribute or we honor the Dakota whenever we are about to start a presentation, because we are on their land, and it was through fascism that the United States targeted the indigenous because they were indigenous. I mean, that is fascism. The president is in the White House because enslaved people built that White House. Now, the president currently occupying did not hold the slaves who built the house, but he benefits from their labor by living in that house. And it's important to look at wealth as multi-generational. Nobody has wealth just because of purely their own activities. Because when you're born, someone has to pay for your food and your crib and your shelter and so forth. Maybe that's your parents or your guardians. Well, where did they get their wealth? From your grandparents. Where did they get their wealth? From your great-grandparents and so forth. And so we have to look at those roots. We have to be consciously aware that we stand on shoulders, and some of those shoulders are fascist shoulders. And if we look at ourselves that way, if we look at ourselves as Americans, as not just being in a republic or in a country that promotes democracy, but in a country that practiced active fascism, and if we accept that as part of who we are, then I think we can more honestly deal with ourselves and with our fellow Americans and with the rest of the world, instead of putting on this front all the time. I mean, I don't know about you, but it's really tiring to have to put on this face that we're exceptional or that we're better than everybody else. If we just accept that we are human because we are, and that being human means that we're as flawed as everybody else, then that allows us to be a better global partner, I think.
I mean, I guess my thoughts echo both the other panelists. I do think that there is generally across the world, especially I speak especially from Europe, where there's like only now some of the beginnings of the conversations on decolonialization that are happening in the US. Those are starting to happen here. But I guess in a specific slice of acknowledging one's past and transgressions. I mean, I speak to you all from Berlin, which has a very specific kind of history to it in terms of unpacking and confronting its own fascism that it's created and its own genocide of the Holocaust. And there's so many monuments and reminders across the city of what happened here. And the way that it's taught to Germans is very particular of it's not ignoring what happened, but like a direct confrontation. Now, that doesn't mean that it's perfect. There are white nationalist and white supremacist groups that exist here in Germany. There's the AfD, which is, one could argue, not a very far stone's throw from the National Socialist Party, but there is a confrontation of that history here in the city, in education. There isn't a confrontation of Germany's own relationships to enslaved people. That's starting to be like a growing awareness. But I think echoing off of Christopher's point, there is less of a pretense of pretending that everything is fine, or that there is this much more, I think, direct engagement, and there has to be, with the atrocities that have sort of been created by a group of people.
And I want to add that what was so striking to me in this text by Toni Morrison that I began with are these steps to the final solution. She has 10 of them. But when you read those steps, you realize that a lot of those are just part of everyday life. And they just kind of almost taken as a given. Construct an internal enemy as both focus and diversion. Who doesn't do that? So just kind of realizing that there is a seed of fascism in so many factors of life, but then there are all these other factors that probably have to happen to amplify those and actually to kind of cook it, to bring it to fruition. So I don't know if we are all fascists to some degree, but there is a lot of elements of fascism in a lot of what we do, I guess. Question from Mary Begley. Hello, Mary. How did fascism become so go-to synonym for people I don't like? Is it an American phenomenon or broader? And I have to add to this question that one of my very first experiences with American political discourse was at the time of Obamacare discussions and protests and whatnot. And I was still abroad. I was still living abroad, so I was watching it on the TV, this demonstrator who was calling Obama a fascist and a communist in the same sentence. So it was literally kind of my introduction of, oh, these things are happening in that strange country. So, and this is a question that I'm also very curious about. Are we not using too much these labels of either fascist or communist, really, to just like bad MF?
I mean, I think the answer is yes. Like people will misuse words all the time to sort of emphasize a point, and that can be rooted to fears they have or cultural fears. I mean, using communist as a threat or a label to paint someone negatively, I think very like reaches not very far back in US history if we think of like the Red Scare, but if we also look at other words that have become weaponized, like social justice warrior, that was a big rallying cry of Gamergate, to just mean someone that supports identity politics. And just labeling someone in the shorthand of an SJW was enough to get them harassed by Gamergate, which was a widespread harassment campaign. So people will use words without meaning all the time. I mean, that's also just how language is constructed. We will say, you know, a very innocuous example is saying LOL when you're not actually laughing, right? I mean, words get misshapen and misused all the time. I think when we're looking at things like hate speech or white supremacy or white nationalism, that's when words really do matter, right? No one, I think the thing I want to emphasize is no one falls into white supremacy. No one accidentally becomes a white nationalist, just the way that no one accidentally rapes someone. You make a series of decisions, right? You can turn the train around at any point if you want. And I think it's really important to sort of highlight that there is agency that someone has in engaging with an ideology. And I think sometimes we forget that it can seem like culture is going one way, but that's also because a bunch of people have agreed together to engage with that culture, right? And so I think it is important that like then the weaponization of the word communist, for example, is sort of a part of that like a broader weaponization, right? Again, no one falls into white supremacy. It's a series of decisions people make, hundreds of decisions, small decisions, hundreds of actions that they do. Like no one.
I think that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, no one makes you get on a pedestal and say things that are racist or anti-immigrant, right? That is a decision someone chooses to do. And we should always sort of, I think, underscore agency here a lot.
I agree with a lot, like pretty much everything you said, and especially in regard to how often language is misused, and that what becomes interesting is how that misuse of language also ends up entering our kind of dictionary, our vocabulary, cultural vocabulary. So when Boris asked me this question, also I think when I started working with him, and I don't feel like I have a good answer also, because people are going to continue to misuse it, just like people are going to continue to call everything communist or call everything socialist when it's not. And I tried in my research to start using capital F fascism as a way of differentiating specifically what I'm talking about and interested in with regard to American fascism from this sort of like, rallying against the man, calling the man fascist, which, also I have no problem with, but it is a different type of usage of language. So I don't think you can stop that usage, and I think that it will continue to be used that way, but maybe that there are other ways for us to resituate the word fascism within a more specified context, like either identifying it as American fascism or as a particular brand of fascism or capital F fascism.
I agree with the other two panelists about the importance of being careful with language and with terminology. I figure that if you are actively oppressing a group of people because of who they are, then that is engaging in fascism. And if you support that, then you are supporting fascism. Now, if you call someone a fascist just because they disagree with you, then it's just a matter of what do they disagree about. It may not be fascism if it's a disagreement about what color the sky is, let's say. But if someone supports bringing back segregation, let's say, and you don't, then that other person supports something that was a fascist American policy. And I think we're seeing a resurgence of words like fascism and even slavery, really, because there's this polarization that we have in our political discourse, and the terminology has become as extreme as the sides. I mean, for people to actually say that being forced to wear a mask is the same as slavery, I mean, it's not, but for anyone to just be able to say that means that they feel genuinely that they are really oppressed, and the only kind of oppression that they're vaguely familiar with or that they've heard of, maybe in history class, is slavery. And so that's their go-to, even though they don't really know that much about the history that they're just so casually talking about. It's kind of like when people fly the Confederate flags in the North. I've talked to quite a few people who do this or who have friends who do this. And for them, it's not necessarily about the South. It's about being rebellious, and that they fly the Confederate flag just because they know that it ticks off the left. It's their way of owning the libs, let's say. So they're just playing with all these very charged political symbols that have this tremendous baggage. And you just have to be careful about who you say certain things to and where you fly certain flags, because you can get yourself seriously hurt if you show that stuff in the wrong place or to the wrong person.
There's a question that I will answer really quickly. Laura Code asks, what is the title of the speech that I quoted? So it's called Racism and Fascism. It was given at Howard University by Toni Morrison at 1995. I have it in this book. It's called The Source of Self-Regard, but I believe that speech is available for free on the internet if you Google it. And the next question from Amelius White. I'm in the beginning stages of reading a book called Fascism, A Warning by Madeleine Albright. She mentions that Mussolini popularized the term drain the swamp, albeit in Italian. Learning this fact for the first time tells me that many of us are largely ignorant of how fascism can manifest in our current political culture. How do we combat that ignorance? Very important question, given that all three of you are educators to various degrees.
I mean, I would say like events like this, you know, I would say like, I guess like large systems wise, like having to revamp a lot of history and American education, right, to include some of these more complicated but more truthful histories. But I think, I mean, I do think advocacy is quite helpful.
Yeah, as a teacher, so I teach both high school and college, and in teaching them, it's really important to me that I don't just teach what I learned in college, because what I learned is primarily a history of whiteness. You know, art history is all about Europe, and so trying to re-educate myself and then bring that effort to my students so that they have a better grounding in the, you know, vast landscape of contemporary art and its artists. So yeah, I mean, to me, it really falls back on education, and part of why I teach and get so much out of teaching.
It's definitely important to educate about fascism. And what I have found is that students are more receptive to learning the hard truths when I'm as factual as possible in my lectures, and I don't try to put in too much of my own opinion. I mean, I'll definitely say this happened in this country or this happened in this state. I won't go the extra mile and say that America's a bad place because of it, or that Minnesota's a bad state. But I'll say that, you know, bad things happened here, and you can take that any way you want, but you have to take it though. And I do a lot of debriefing with my students. I ask, you know, how do you feel about what you just learned? And so I give them a chance to vent and to I get a lot of, well, why didn't I learn this in high school? I get that question a lot. Like, why do I have to be 18 and learn about this? And, you know, students, I think, really do feel cheated when they get a sort of glossed over history, and then they come to a college course and they learn something different. And I don't know how that can be changed. I don't know how people can learn the hard stuff earlier. All I can do is do what I do now in college and teach my children things while they're young and not in college yet. But that's just a couple of children. That's not everybody.
Thank you. Carolyn, question for you. Do you see a difference in the trends of behavior online and their connections to fascism depending on the different social media platforms they originate in?
I definitely do. And this should probably be my last question because I'm going to go to bed. I mean, a lot of it really does come down to enforcement. So deplatforming works. Deplatforming is where you like remove someone's account, and it can happen across a variety of different kinds of platforms or internet service providers. So like the deplatforming of the Daily Stormer, a neo-Nazi blog website, where like even their hosting website deplatformed them, where they had to then be pushed to Tor. So that's an encryption privacy browser where you don't have necessarily like regular websites, but you'll have onion websites and they're very long URLs. That really cut down on traffic, right? Or like when someone is removed from Twitter, right? And they're forced to then exist on something like Gab or Parler. Those kinds of mechanisms are extremely helpful because regardless of where you sit in your political ideology, like let's say you are the biggest white supremacist in the world, you're still actually engaging with what we call the clear net, which is like the internet we're all on. You're still reading, you're probably using Gmail. You probably have a Facebook account, right? You are probably on these areas that are much more like institutionalized in our lives, that are like everyday things in the internet. You aren't just solely existing on these alternatives. And so this is why you see like ups and downs in terms of like usage on these alternatives. It's why like Gab is not necessarily a household name, because like you're still using other things, right? So like deplatforming works extremely well, but not all sites have the same kind of policy in terms of taking down content. YouTube, for example, is very reactive in terms of reporting, but it does not research like what are hate speech trends, and then they don't go and then just decide to remove something. So they aren't keeping a roster of like internally of white nationalists or white supremacist YouTubers. NGOs and think tanks like Hope Not Hate in the UK or the Southern Poverty Law Center will build relationships with content teams and policy teams at YouTube and present like, here are exact videos and people who are doing like XYZ behavior, but YouTube is not like proactively taking these things down. So that's why you can see an unevenness of like why certain people are still there versus not. And that unevenness, I think, is a problem. You'll see the suppression of content. So if you, for example, try to look at the hashtag Save the Children, which is a hashtag popularized by QAnon, and it's around a big conspiracy theory around child slavery, which led to Pizzagate. We don't have enough time to like get into that conspiracy, but I just recommend Googling it. It is a conspiracy. There's not millions of missing children sold into like sex slavery. That's that happens, but not at the rate they say. But like that, when you now search that on Instagram, it leads you to a plain page, not even interstitial, but a page that is like a warning. So it's adding like a frictive element, right? So like, it all depends on the platform. None of them are perfect. None of them are, I would say, like proactively going out of their ways to like quietly minimize things. Other than, I think, like Twitter's response to ISIS and ISIS content. But like generally a lot of pressure will come from like academic research labs, NGOs, or journalists who are saying like, hey, like there's this problem. Here is a bunch of accounts with thousands of followers, and we found these things. Platforms do actually respond to bad press pretty well, but none of them are perfect. And they all have their different slices of what proliferates. So on Instagram, Save the Children was getting really big through like white influencer moms, for example. But like more traditional hate speech, or the way we conceptualize it, like some of those accounts were getting taken down faster, but like the Save the Children stuff was not. So like individual platforms have their kind of like individual flavor of shittiness, if you will, of like what is allowed to stay up versus what is not.
This is quite scary, what you're saying. Is the single defining factor in kind of ability of violent content to develop is freedom to develop it?
Yes.
Like if you don't restrict it, it just will happen?
Yes, 100%. like the biggest issue I think is this fear of violating the First Amendment, which again, I have to emphasize that like that is a very specific US interpretation of freedom of speech in relationship to the US Constitution. For example, like I live in Europe. I have a lot of freedom to protest here in Berlin. We have way different hate speech laws here. And I am not censored as an individual. I do not have any less freedoms than Americans do. But there's a different relationship to responding to speech and what is considered hate speech or like appropriate speech, right? And so I think it's really important to emphasize that. And then the greater emphasis is like platforms have this fear and almost an allergy to wanting to take down content. And it gets wrapped up in a variety of ways of like, what if it's satire? We don't want to censor, but also a lot of it comes down to it's more work for them to do a lot of this stuff. And this work is not easy, right? To understand what's happening in a conversation. If someone is using a gendered slur, for example, or a racial slur, what if it's two friends, right, who are engaging in a conversation using that and it's a joke? So like a bigger issue here is like, one, that the fact that this content is allowed to proliferate, and two, that like we let companies in the United States create their own governance structures and their own like service design structures of companies. We are not saying you need to employ X amount of people per thing, or we will fine you hundreds of millions of dollars. The EU tried to pass something like that, where they were like, you have 24 hours to report, to respond to every single report, or you will be fined millions of dollars. And that was almost too stringent because there was no conceivable way for them to do that. So I think there needs to be this kind of balance, but understanding of like, it's not just the policy, it's like the logistics of implementing this. And there's this hesitation by platforms related to capitalism of like why they won't do that. But I think these are communication tools. We should start to view them more as public infrastructure, which meaning that we need specific standards of response, specific standards of like content, like what is allowed to be online, and then a lot of transparency into these systems. So like how many content moderators are employed by Twitter, for example, in the United States, focusing on issues in the US versus how many content moderators are employed in Europe who can read Hebrew or can understand like Serbo-Croatian and then Croatian politics, right? It's like if we start to get into very specific lines of identity, or who understand, the Serbian-Bosnian conflict, which is called the Croatian War for Independence, right? Like how many content moderators can speak that language and understand that nuance? So that's also like this greater issue. Like I can't tell you the amount of content moderators that do that, right? Because we have no numbers on that. And this is how we lead to like much more downstream effects, like the genocide that's happening in Myanmar. So like this lack of transparency is a really big issue. And also this lack of ability for us to fight with regulatory power against these companies. And we're starting to see those slow changes. But I think that's like one of the biggest issues. It's not just that hate speech is there, it's that, well, what even are the mechanisms for responding or adjudicating to it? And we aren't really given clear answers.
Do you think it's like growing pains of this whole system that is still relatively new on the history scale, or there is something really systemically wrong with it?
I guess because it's 3:30 a.m., my answer is it's capitalism. But the answer is also capitalism. Like we have a specific idea of what success looks like for a company. We have a specific idea of what scale is. We have a specific idea of what a company needs to do to maintain its successfulness. And that involves a monetary bottom line. And what it doesn't involve is a baseline for measuring community health. So like the idea of what is considered a successful company, and this is, I think, I would argue, this is a very like modern 21st century problem. This is not like a US versus EU cultural problem. It is like how we define success is that a company, once it hits certain metrics, is expected to continually surpass those metrics, right? And so if a company was built on a premise of we don't need a lot of content moderation and this is how much money we make and this is how much content people are producing, then like if the success is to continually hit those numbers, you can never build the system you need to build to respond to these harms, because the construct of your metrics of success are flawed, right? So like if your budget of operation is the same amount of the money you make, based under the auspices of how we define success for companies, like financial success, that is not a successful company, right? That's a successful nonprofit because you spent your whole budget, and that's what you're supposed to do every year. But I think the big issue here is how we define success. So it's almost impossible, I think, under that lens of capitalism to sort of change what a company needs to do. And this is where I think like regulatory power is necessary, or that we shift the framing of like, what are these tools? We should view them more as like public infrastructure, as telecom tools, as publishing platforms, which they aren't specifically under Section 230, which is a whole other conversation. But we view them, I think, a lot as things that we choose to engage with as entertainment. And I think that framing is wrong, because something we use so frequently in our everyday lives, we should treat very seriously. And we shouldn't treat it as it's very easy to quit Facebook. It's not. Like, lots of people can't for a variety of reasons, a variety of really nuanced reasons. A lot of countries outside of the global north, Facebook has brokered a deal where like that's their access to the internet. So quitting Facebook isn't just like getting on another platform. You lose your ability to actually get online, right? And then in the United States, it is a way that we talk to each other, right? So you're asking someone to give up their community. These are very serious issues, right? It's not a superfluous thing to be like, oh, Facebook, I'm just going to leave it. Like you're asking someone to give up a kind of societal or socio-technical infrastructure that they have access to. And so I think the framing is we'll view it as an infrastructure, and then we have to redefine how that exists, because we're used to only seeing it as a company that's supposed to make lots and lots of money, right?
And on this depressing note,
And that's what I'm here for, right? I'm here for depressing doses of reality.
oh my God. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Good night, and please feel free to check out when you feel like you cannot have it anymore.
On that note, I will go. Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor to be with Christopher and Brooks in conversation. Thank you, Boris, for leading this. And thank you for having me.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Carolyn.
Thank you.
And the next question is there any importance to be given to the role of Minnesota in a civil war, or is it irrelevant to our history?
Oh, okay. So when it comes to the Civil War in Minnesota, I think it's important to understand that Minnesota's role entering the Union Army early in 1861 and fighting on the Union side does not negate that Minnesota was heavily reliant on money from slaveholders, even during the Civil War. You have to keep in mind that when Minnesota entered the Civil War in 1861 on the Union side, the Union had slave states, and they were border states, but they were slave states nonetheless. And they were not fighting to free Confederate slaves in 1861. That doesn't happen for another 2 years in 1863. And even when the Emancipation Proclamation is put into effect in 1863, not every Minnesotan is pleased with it, because there are people who thought that the Union and the Confederacy should ultimately come to the discussion table and work out a treaty. And some people were really upset that Lincoln decided to make the Union effort about freeing the slaves, because then the Confederates would never want to negotiate. And over the summer, I read newspapers from Chatfield, Minnesota, from 1863, 1864. The Chatfield Democrat newspaper had all sorts of editorials that just disparaged the Emancipation Proclamation and that now the war was about slavery. And that paper actually called the Civil War the N-word war. And they didn't feel that it was worth one white life to die to free a black person. So that's what I'm talking about when I say that you can't glorify history. You can't glorify Minnesota as a good state just because it fought for the Union. And again, Minnesota still had money from Confederates. One of the reasons, well, the reason that William Aiken never got his money back from the U of M is because the Minnesota state legislature passed a law that said that the U of M didn't have to pay it back because Aiken lives in a Confederate state. And no one who lives in a Confederate state can go to Minnesota and sue. So, yeah, Minnesota fought for the Union, but Minnesota wanted to keep slaveholder money, even Confederate slaveholder money. So, if that makes the Civil War irrelevant to what I said, then so be it.
Brooks, you want to add anything to this?
I don't have anything to add, no. That was perfect, yeah.
Okay. Questions from John Olmschild. I hope I not mispronounced the name. Do you see similarities between Trump rallies and the Nuremberg Nazi rallies?
I don't feel I know enough about the Nuremberg Nazi rallies in particular to be able to say. I think that I am alarmed by Trump rallies, and I think Trump rallies are often do facilitate a fascist identity and ideology. Whether that is that similar to the Nuremberg Nazi rallies, I don't know. But certainly it's a certainly Trump rallies are, I think, fascist events.
Well, I'm certainly stricken by the sort of cult of personality that seems to have taken place in both kinds of rallies. And I think it is in part because, as several people have noted over the past few weeks, that the Republican Party is the party of Trump, and you cannot be a successful Republican politician and not be loyal to Trump. And I don't remember ever in my 47 years of an American political party being that aligned with one person. And certainly the Democratic Party of Obama's 8 years wasn't known as Obamaism and wasn't Clintonism during Clinton's 2 terms, nor was Republicanism Bushism in the 2000s or in the early 90s. And even when you had Reagan Democrats in the 1980s, it wasn't that same kind of cult of personality that you have with Trump. I don't remember people being that aligned with Reagan, like Reagan was almost like their god, the way that people seem to worship Trump nowadays.
Brooks, anything to add?
No.
Okay, this one is interesting. Some describe political ideas as on a sphere. So this is the sphere. These are the ideas. Has the far left met the far right? So we go on a sphere and eventually they met. Or how does far left politics and far right politics differ at this point?
I don't believe in a political spectrum as on a sphere. I I think that there are fundamental differences about what happens as you move towards the left and what happens as you move towards the right. And even though there is the possibility for both of those to stray into authoritarianism, things considered centrist, like a republic, can easily become a totalitarian regime, a fascist regime. I mean, that even goes back to ancient Rome, right? Where you have Caesar's takeover of the Republic, and the Republic facilitated that. The Republic survived beyond it. So, you know, I think that there's another kind of thing that has come up, which is fascism is often described by necessitating a big government, which is often associated with the left. But I think the caveat there with regard to a big government is that it's a big government for a select few, and that everybody else is sort of excluded from those privileges. And so in Germany, it was Germans, people who could, cite their origin in that landscape, and Jews and other people deemed undesirables did not have the same access to that big government infrastructure. And I don't think that to me does not mean that it's a big government. It means that it's just a different structure of small government, where small government gives a lot of privileges to a few. And so it looks big to those few, but is not actually big overall. And so, I think it's really hard to just generally chart political ideologies. But to me, a sphere is probably the least useful one. Well, a line actually is the least useful.
I would agree with all that. I don't think I have anything to add.
Well, there's a interesting dynamic going on there, but I also will disagree that politics exist on a sphere. And moreover, and again, I'm not a political scientist, and everything I know about American politics I knew from newspapers and conversations in the last 5 years, basically, since I landed here. I don't think there is a far left in this country.
Yeah.
I just don't believe there exists any prominent to any degree far left in the same way that in a kind of understanding of far left that we will have in Europe. There is far right for sure. It's very prominent. You can see it, you can hear it, you can see influence of it. Far left, I think it's a very kind of peculiar quirk of American politics. It's something like Green New Deal can be called communist and socialist and far left. It's not by any stretch. So even if it was a sphere, there is a kind of very, very, very long way for the left in this country to go to meet anything like far right.
I mean, to add on to that, there's an interesting story I heard in listening to the artist Sia Armajani's artist talk a couple years ago. And he talked about how he had this artwork that was built where there was a tree in the Walker Sculpture Garden, and then a bridge that went over the tree and down the other side. And they had to disassemble the sculpture early because they got so many threats from eco-terrorists. And so, like, when we look at the difference between leftist terrorism and rightist terrorism, you have threats to infrastructure based on environmental ideals. I have no support for the ideology that it's good to blow up a bridge that goes over a tree, but it wasn't a threat to a person, and it was rooted in a different kind of ideology than, say, the group that was caught by the FBI before they were able to kidnap the governor of Michigan and execute her, which was their plan. And so even just thinking about that spectrum, I don't see them as meeting ever. I see them as both being, horrific instances of violence that are unnecessary, one being worse than the other in terms of, facilitating murder. But nonetheless, I don't see them as being anywhere near the same type of violence.
Richard Bernard, I sit alone in a room, as do all of you. How do I and others accomplish change when it seems such a hopeless task? Probably only one or two I know are even watching this, and I wouldn't know who they are. I happen to believe we all can affect change, but it does seem so hopeless. Anything encouraging to say?
Well, I think that everybody can do something. I was actually just teaching about this today in my lecture. I was talking about how, especially as a parent, whenever my kids are exposed to something, I jump on that really quickly and address what I think is the problem. For example, when my youngest son was in the Cub Scouts and I went to the Cub Scout store or the Boy Scout store in Sartell to get his uniform and other things, I noticed the book section, and there was a book of jokes to tell at Boy Scout campouts and so forth. And there were a few jokes that were ethnic. And there were jokes that had to do with Native Americans and with Asians. And I went to the cashier, and the cashier told me to write to the manager. And so I wrote to the manager about the book, and I mentioned the jokes and what pages they were on. And I said, that your group promotes itself as embracing diversity. This book challenges that. This book doesn't jive with what you say you promote. Let me know what you plan to do about that. And it wasn't that long afterward that the Sartell store withdrew the book from the store. And then I noticed online on the National Boy Scouts website, where they sell their merchandise, that the joke book was withdrawn from the merchandise page too. So it had not only a local level, but a national level of impact. And something closer to home was when I was asking my students if they had ever been exposed to any kind of behavior, especially on the job, about being told to deliberately treat other people differently because of how they look. And I've had more than one student tell me that when they worked at a store, they were told to follow the Black customers because they're the ones who shoplift. And there's a student who had the same thing about a different store, but following around Native American customers. And so right then and there in class, I wrote to that store and I said that I have heard that your store does this. If you do, why do you do that? Is it possible for you to stop? And that was a Thursday. And then the next class on Tuesday, after the weekend, the student came back and said, I went to work over the weekend and the manager took everybody in and said, don't follow Native Americans anymore. And so sometimes it just takes something that simple to write a letter, to just say, I think this is wrong. And, sometimes you get results like I've been able to. Sometimes you don't. And I don't always get the result I want, but I at least make the effort to just put it out there. So at least I was not silent. And I think everybody can do that at the very least.
That's really powerful.
Thank you.
I don't think I have anything to add. Well, I mean, I guess I definitely, I do feel like, you know, just trying to do small things add up in big ways. Reading, educating yourself, and then speaking up, as Christopher said.
Well, this is kind of follow up on using fascism and communism, for that matter, as synonyms of bad guy. I listened today to a bit of Rush Limbaugh's show. I don't know who that is. And he was rallying on feminazis. Any comments on that? I think I can comment a lot on that, but I'll give you the
I mean, it looks like someone commented projection, which I think is, yeah, a good summation. You know, it's similar to, I think, when people describe communism as being fascist, or totalitarian communist regimes as being fascist, because it's this association of um, of a of an ideology with something that is that obscures from what you're actually looking at. I mean, I think it's a tactic of diverting attention, of getting someone to look elsewhere so that they don't actually notice the rhetoric that's live in your presentation of fascism. There, you know, like looking at in my presentation, I mentioned Gerald L.K. Smith, and he in particular had a line where he condemns the bureaucratic fascism of American government. Now, Gerald L.K. Smith is absolutely a fascist. That, to my interpretation of his identifying the bureaucratic aspect of American fascism, was in an attempt to sort of associate that big government idea with American government. And really it's effective because then you can say, well, then if someone were to say, oh, Gerald L.K. Smith is a fascist, one of his supporters or somebody who is potentially sympathetic to him can say, well, here though, he's condemning fascism. And so you can look at Rush Limbaugh and say, oh, Rush Limbaugh is condemning Nazism by talking about these feminazis. But really, he's just performing his own fascist ideology.
I've always looked at the word feminazi as Limbaugh's way of trying to make feminism, as he understands it, to be as extreme on the political spectrum as possible, and to seem as intolerant as it possibly could be. I mean, back then, when Limbaugh started his show, calling someone a Nazi was largely considered a bad thing in the United States. It's been within the last 4 years that they've been called very fine people, but it used to be that they were universally bad. And so you attach Nazi to the end of an ideology like feminism, then you've painted it as radical and something aligned with Adolf Hitler. And whereas feminism, as I've understood it, was about having equity between men and women in the workforce, in pay, in whatever. Generally speaking, when you talk about equality, you're not talking about fascism, because you're not talking about putting someone down because of who they are. And so using Nazi was not grounded in any kind of reality or any kind of consistency with political language. It was just to paint feminism as radical, or feminists as radical. And certainly with Limbaugh's audience, he succeeded in doing that.
Brooks, I'm guessing you don't have anything to add.
Well, like one other thought I had is that by, it's easy to be like the Nazis were the bad guys. We were the good guys who fought the Nazis, right? And so by associating feminism with Nazism, it's this immediate way of trying to situate someone as the bad guy. And I think that that's really, it's a really successful propaganda tool, as we've seen in America over the last decade, 2 decades-ish.
Yeah, I guess I have a lot to say about that, but I'd rather go. And we are 7 minutes before the end, and I'm somewhat curating the questions now. But someone is asking, it's not necessarily from the top right now. Someone has asked whether the word racism sometimes is being misused, or racist is being misused to the same extent as fascist and communist.
Well, for me, I'm actually controversial to some of my colleagues, because when I teach, I don't use the word race or racist or racism. I obviously talk about very hard stuff like slavery and discrimination and segregation. But in my 20 years of teaching, I have found that if you talk about racism, it's not really seen by people as something structural, but rather something personal. So if you tell someone that what they espouse or what they believe sounds racist, they can always counter with, well, I'm not. I have a black friend. So I avoid that altogether just by saying, this is what the United States did, or this is what the United States does. The United States enslaved. The United States segregated. The United States killed people because of their color, and so forth. These are facts. So when you just lay it out like that, and you don't attach the word racist or anything to it, it's hard to say, well, no, America didn't kill, I have a black friend. You can't pivot to that. So you have to accept the facts that are laid out there. So I try to focus on the acts of discrimination and the acts of slavery and any other act that oppressed a group of people because of who they were. Now that is exactly how people would define racism, but that's just not the word that I use. So by avoiding the words, I get people to focus on the actions so they don't pivot away just out of reflex.
That's really interesting. I want to think more about that personal versus structural and how much that, that makes total sense to me. I don't think that racism is overused or used improperly, but it's also really hard to talk generally about that without having specifics to reference. And maybe that's also just like generally part of a breakdown of language is having difficulty speaking generally about these things that are huge issues. It's hard.
Yeah, and we saw the pivot actually in the questions, because in my remarks, I focused exclusively on the act of slavery. And someone wanted to pivot to, well, what about Minnesota being a hero in the Civil War?
Oh, yeah.
And that was when I wasn't using the word racist, but by maintaining the focus and even using what I know about Minnesota history to dismantle that whataboutism, I was just able to keep the focus where I wanted it to be, and to not let that pivot gained fruition, but to kill it where it was.
Yeah.
We need to wrap up, and I want to ask one more question before we do that from Sheila Paca. I like the definition of fascism as marketing for power. One that has struck me, what struck me is how Trump reverses the meaning. Antifa became the enemy, according to him. He attacks others using claims that might very well describe himself. And I actually want to kind of start answering that by myself, because this Antifa, criminalized Antifa phenomenon was, to me, one of the most striking events of the past year. How can you, just purely aesthetically, talking about the subject of this whole project, aesthetics of fascism, aesthetically, how you possibly can say that anti-fascism is a bad thing? Like, how that can turn into something that can be used? And it was greatly facilitated just by the fact that they chose Antifa, an abbreviation for the movement, instead of remaining anti-fascism. And I believe it was still anti-fascism, it wouldn't be weaponized in a way it did. But it became Antifa, and then suddenly it kind of just flows with the speech, and you can ignore what it actually means. But then, okay, what do you have to say about that?
I also think like the change of the vowels, like Antifa, like that further, separates it from anti-fascism, makes it more sort of other, more alien, and more easily a sort of target.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that with Trump being able to use Antifa, he was able to make it less of an ideology and more of an organization. And we saw this with one of the debates where Trump kept telling Biden that Antifa is not an ideology, it's a group. But in doing that, Trump is able to get his listeners to move away from the ideology and think of the organization. Whereas if we're going to target fascism, we have to call it out. We have to use the right vowel, and we have to say the whole word fascism, not just stop at the fa. But when you pervert a word like that and make it devoid of its context, then you can manipulate it any way you want, which is what Trump has done with anti-fascist, at least among his followers.
I also think it like, in going back to the idea of the circle, in order to sort of, paint the Proud Boys and other far-right extremists as a kind of, as a normal, aspect of political extremism, there had to be a far left version. There had to be the other side that met that far right, so that you could say, you could like, create this idea of the moderate middle that is, just going to sit there and protect the institutions that exist as they exist from these extremism, from this extremism on both sides. And I think that's like also why I brought up both sidism at the end of my talk, because I think it ultimately facilitates a rise of fascism, a rise of these far right ideologies, even if that's happening in their own circles, in their own communities, on the internet or in person.
Okay, and on this note, we have to say goodnight. Thank you all so much. There are 64 people who are still with us. Thank you all so much for being with us, and thank you so much to our speakers, and including Carolyn, who sadly had to go to sleep. Okay, and you will all be sent a survey after this event, and we would really appreciate if you would fill it out. It helps us design programs and initiatives that matter to you. If you complete your survey, you will be entering a lottery, I should say, to win $20 to spend in our gift shop. And stay creative, and good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Christopher.